Ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome to the BlockCrunch podcast, the go-to podcast for investors and builders in crypto. And before we get started, just a reminder for you guys out there, the BlockCrunch podcast is intended for informational purposes only. Neither the host nor its guests are licensed financial advisors, and nothing discussed should be construed as financial advice. Views held by BlockCrunch's guests are their own, and sponsorship messages do not constitute financial advice or endorsement. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Today's episode of the BlockCrunch podcast is brought to you by Collab+, the team behind Filecoin. So to tell us a little bit more is Colin Efren, who leads ecosystem at Collab+. So Colin, can you tell us what's one thing that people misunderstand about Filecoin the most?
One thing people don't realize is that the launch of smart contracts on Filecoin in Q1 of this year will transform the Filecoin network into the world's largest open data economy and a full-fledged layer one within Web3. Most people think of Filecoin as the world's largest decentralized storage network. And while that's true, the community onboarded 450 petabytes of real data in 2022, up 18 times from the beginning of last year. Q1 of this year is transformational. The community is launching the Filecoin virtual machine where users can start writing programs to automate storage and renewal of data, pay for computation, and trigger retrievals. All of which is built on a permissionless market of hardware providers that is 15 exabytes in size. This will open the world's largest data economy and make Filecoin one of the most powerful layer one blockchains in Web3.
Hello there. Now, before we move on, I'd love to thank the hundreds of you who have subscribed to BlockCrunch VIP, because with your support, I've been able to share my real thoughts on specific projects that I don't usually share on interviews in a format that I enjoy more, which is bi-weekly written posts. We've also been able to offer exclusive AMAs, sharing my investment frameworks, interactable models, and breaking down important trends before they become big. Now, we even had Elon Musk comment on one of our threads recently. So if you haven't already, head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP, and you can access dozens of hours of research for what you'd spend on a coffee a day. And hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the BlockCrunch podcast. Now, as part of our Crypto Narratives to Watch in 2023 series, we're talking to pioneers in different themes and verticals in crypto. Now, many of us have talked about the failings of centralized social networks and how they've been detrimental to freedom of speech, user privacy, and more. But yet, we haven't seen any large Web3 social network emerge just yet. So is it possible for this to maybe be the next theme alongside other themes like identity, digital ownership that comes with it? So to discuss all of this, I'm really excited to have Derek from Collab+Currency to talk about Web3 social, consumer applications in general, and why he's spending all his time in this vertical. So welcome to the show, Derek.
Jason, I'm glad to be here. I'm a longtime listener of all of your stuff, and also a reader of your long Twitter threads. And so it's a pleasure to be here and chat a little bit about consumer Web3.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. And just to get us started, could you tell our listeners a little bit about what Collab+Currency is? Because I see you guys a lot on Twitter, but I think you guys are focusing on something that most actually aren't looking at yet.
Yeah, happy to go into detail on the background here. I'll give a little background on myself just to kind of set the stage. So went to law school and business school. After business school, started a consumer products company with a few of my business school classmates. I passed the bar just before that. Decided not to practice law and dive right into starting my own business. We built that up nationally here in the US. And then in 2017, 2018, that project ended up migrating to a much larger player in the space. I took about a year to transition. And then during that time, started teaching at the university level, marketing and entrepreneurship. And during that time, I was kind of like on let's call it like entrepreneurship sabbatical. Got really interested in the intersection of regulated assets and blockchains. So things like security tokens, if you remember. Started publishing and reconnected with one of my business school finance professors from a decade prior. His name's Steve. He's now my business partner at the fund. We published together. We started researching together. He had started advising a much larger consumer Web3 fund or consumer fund in Web2 called Collaborative Fund. And so he was helping invest out of their main fund, starting to do crypto deals. I started advising on that project, on the fund, and then him and I ended up spinning out Collab+Currency out of Collaborative Fund. So Collaborative Fund is known as a very large Web2 investor. They invested in things like Reddit and Quora and Lyft. And so we've always had this lineage of consumer kind of baked into what we were doing. But most of the stuff that we did early on, as you know, in 2018, 2019, 2020, just like was very technical. We hadn't really moved that far up the stack. And so the earliest positions in Fund 1 were things like layer ones or infrastructure plays like Bison Trails, DeFi protocols before 2020. But I would say the turning point for the fund, and around the same time that we spun out and started Collab+Currency, him and I, was a project called Super Rare. And so what Super Rare was doing was essentially replicating the contemporary art market on chain using smart contracts and the ERC 721 wrapper to connote scarcity around the digital art that was being produced on that platform. It was kind of like an aha moment for myself and Steve. I wrote a piece that summer, in summer 2020, called "You're Sleeping on Crypto Art." That piece basically made the argument that you could replicate Sotheby's and Christie's and the function of the contemporary art market on chain using these primitives, as long as there was a demand to actually hold digital art. And what we found when we were diligencing Super Rare and talking with the artists on that platform and talking with John Crane, who runs that project, was that there certainly was a demand to hold these assets. Some, the trading at that point was very small. People were buying digital art for $300 or $500 or $1,000. But if you drew a line out, you recognize that there was clearly some emerging crypto artists that were starting to do well. There was a demand to hold those objects. And so we became very clear in our thinking around digital art and the opportunity on crypto rails. I would say that project is instructive because it really helps solidify in my mind, just like the ERC 721 wrapper. So this idea that you could have any digital object, in this case it was art, but as long as you wrapped that digital object in a wrapper that was located on a trust minimized ledger like a blockchain, you could start to prove its scarcity. And if you could prove its scarcity, you could start to build property rights on top of that thing. And so where my mind started going, and I alluded to this at the end of the piece, was it wasn't just going to be art on chain. It was going to be gaming assets on chain. It was going to be identity on chain. It was going to be deeds and titles to homes on chain. It was going to be identity on chain. There's going to be all sorts of things on chain that, typically in the physical world would now be replicated in the digital world over the coming decades. So I credit Super Rare and we did that seed round with one confirmation. And since then, I think we've invested in probably 50 or 60 NFT infrastructure projects or projects that are touching on what I would class as consumer Web3.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that because obviously a lot of your thesis at Collab+Currency is about culture and consumer, which is not something that a lot of funds that we've talked to on the show really focuses on. Most of them tend to focus on, as you said, infrastructure, things like ZK rollups and, things like DeFi. So I'm curious, what gave you the conviction to focus only on this vertical or predominantly on this vertical? Besides Super Rare, was there, a bigger trend coming outside of NFTs that maybe that was interesting to you?
Well, let me kind of paint the opportunity maybe a slightly different way. Over the last few decades, like you, Jason, me, Derek, our friends, our family, we're spending more and more time in front of these screens. We're spending more and more time on the internet. And as a result, we're sending emails, we're doing live streams, we're working over Zoom, we're jumping into shared Google Docs. Over the last 2 decades, even though the time we spend is less in these physical spaces and more in these digital spaces, there's never been a native way to create just scarcity around the objects that we enjoy or that we use in these digital environments, whether it's an MP3 or a movie file or an audiobook or a doc or a game. Right? There's just never been any way to create scarcity around digital property or digital objects. And it was clear to me that what blockchains did for commodity money, so Bitcoin and Ethereum, and what it did for disintermediating financial functions, so just Aave or Compound or Uniswap, it would do the same thing once you had this trusted record keeper, this trusted database that was secured by thousands, tens of thousands of participants all around the world. You could start to not just write information around commodity money and the transfer of commodity money, or write information around value flows associated with decentralized finance, but you could also write around these objects or information associated with culture or social or some of these consumer use cases that represent some of the biggest projects and companies in Web 2 and Web 1 and in the non-blockchain world, things like Google or things like Facebook or things like Instagram and many others. And so if you take the view that these are just agnostic record keepers or agnostic databases that are trust minimized, then it was inevitable that more and more experiments and more opportunities around things like that touched consumers and end users would start to proliferate. So I see things like Super Rare or Art Blocks or Axie Infinity or some of these social products that are now starting to come around as being manifestations of the idea that we've now, achieved some level of success lower in the stack technically. And now we've moved up the stack and we're now able to create applications on top of trust minimized technology that can empower hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of users, much in the same way that these applications can inform hundreds of millions, if not billions of users in Web 2. So that's really the thesis, that's the bet, that this architecture, Web 3, will eventually become kind of a liquidity drain for all the world's applications, many of which will touch end users and consumers.
And I think of that, there's a few verticals that you guys mentioned as like core focuses for you in terms of, I think there are things like music, media, gaming, and social. I'd love to kind of bring out the social use case because this is really interesting to me. There's been a lot of talk about the issues facing like Twitter and Facebook and the need to create like a decentralized version of these. So I guess before we dive into that, what do you think is the inherent kind of problem facing users with Web2 social platforms today?
Yeah, I would say the biggest problem is like where the information that gets created by users lives and who owns that. Right now, it's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's these social platforms and their databases. That's all the information that we create and provide value for, whether that's UGC or just information about how we use these products. These aren't owned by us. These are owned by third-party intermediaries. And what is a trust minimized database really good at doing? It's really good at disintermediating rent extraction and allowing users to be owners. And so I would say if I had to point to a specific problem, or especially around like, let's call it Web 2 social, it's that we don't actually own our information. It's owned by these third-party intermediaries. And the way that they monetize their businesses, these platforms, is to use our information to sell that information to people who are willing to pay for it. So, I ran a consumer, business for many years. We employed many of our online strategies around Facebook ads or around, Amazon ads. And so the way that we leveraged the information that existed on this database is that I would pay to use, to get very segmented information about potential buyers of my product. Amazon and Facebook would sell me that information, and I would monetize to their users based on the information that they provided on these databases. I would say it leads to a worse product. It leads to information being used against its owners. It leads to rent extraction in really I would call unelegant ways. I would say the promise of Web3 as it relates to the question you're asking, which is social, is really this opportunity of, can the people who create the value on these platforms actually be the owners of the information that they create, the owners of the stuff that they populate, and be able to monetize it in ways that they deem best or they deem fit, both from a product perspective and also from, what I would call an ethical perspective, being able to own the information that they write. And so it really comes down to this idea of ownership and Web3 ledgers and trust minimized ledgers being an opportunity, a venue to recreate some of these social applications in ways that are more instructive to value creation for the creator or the owner of that content.
Yeah, I'd love to believe in that thesis as well. And I think a lot of founders do. And we see projects like, Cybertino creating these decentralized identities for you to carry across different platforms. We see kind of sufficiently decentralized Twitter, like Farcaster. We have Lens Protocol creating decentralized social graphs. But at the same time, I am sometimes a bit skeptical because on the builder side, it seems like most of the value captured by Facebook and Twitter are in ads, which is built on their proprietary data about its users. So without that massive data value capture, is there an incentive for a founder or a massive company to maintain a social network if everyone can just come in and take that social graph and fork it?
Yeah, so that is so there's two big questions, which is what is the incentive for someone to create a Facebook or an Instagram or a TikTok killer in Web3, knowing that we've seen this race to the bottom with protocols in DeFi, which is just like the ability to take the core protocol and fork it and, you know, allow the both sides of the market to like move over to the next protocol based on incentives. We've just seen this pattern over and over again. The second problem that I would identify is like, is there actually interesting design space that people will care about that aren't really like, 100% down with crypto, right? Like I look at Facebook's numbers or Instagram numbers and like just reaching feature parity with these platforms and being built on Web3 is not what I would consider to be like a massive value prop for my mom or my dad or my non-crypto friends to want to jump over to, right? Like there's going to have to be something more interesting in the design space to get 1 billion users using a decentralized Twitter instead of a Web2 Twitter, right? And right now, I'm just not seeing it. Like I would say that is an existential threat to what you're describing, which is social on-chain. So I would say to the first question, I would actually pose that to founders. Like, are there founders out there out in Web3 that, I would just say more broadly, like, can you design a system that creates some sense of like a moat that prevents people from just forking the protocol and getting like the liquidity of a marketplace onto the consumer side and the creator side of a social application? I would say the answer is probably yes. I just haven't seen anything interesting in that area yet. And then the second question for founders is, can you actually use Web3 Rails or the design space of Web3 in a way that's actually net new and not just reaching feature parity and being built on a decentralized stack? My gut tells me, Jason, that the answer to those two questions is out there. We will see some really interesting experiments in Web3 social. That doesn't mean that they exist today, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's never going to happen. It's just going to take some time for founders to really grok with the primitives of Web3 and create stuff that will actually bring over, the billions of users on Instagram and Facebook and, so on and so forth.
And I guess just to dive into that a bit as well, what are some examples of maybe like net new things you can do on a Web3 social? Because right now it seems like Twitter is exploring NFTs. I think YouTube might be exploring NFTs. I think before too long, we're going to have, all these major Web2 social platforms allowing you to maybe buy and sell NFTs to a certain extent. So that alone might not be sufficient. But I'm curious, like, are there things that maybe these companies just structurally can't do that maybe a Web3 company can?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example of where one second. Can you hear my dog?
A little bit. I like it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, he's going crazy. He's going
here.
crazy down there. So I'll give you an example of like a portfolio company that I think is doing something interesting around Web3 social that can't really be done in Web2. So, and maybe this kind of hints at like what I think identity will look like in Web3. So this idea that like, what can you do on like a blockchain, a trust minimized ledger? Well, you can own assets, right? So assets. You can do transactions on that ledger that follow your public address for the rest of time. So activities. You can join groups, communities, DAOs, and act on behalf of those organizations to be able to make on-chain interactions. And so like a database, a record of all of the actions that your community are doing. So those three things right there. There's assets, there's activities, there's affiliations. Those three things living on a trust minimized ledger actually offer really interesting primitives to create a social application or identity around a user profile. So gallery.so is one of my portfolio companies. And this is a very crude example, but just to paint the opportunity for you, Jason, that allows me to showcase my identity through those three things, just, to start off. It allows me to show you the assets that I curate and collect. Those assets could be on-chain generative art. It could be a PFP that represents my, Twitter profile. It could be a membership card to, Proof or Quantum or one of these membership clubs. It allows me to take basically my on-chain interactions and, showcase those on-chain interactions. So another example would be Rabbit Hole. So like the ability for me to engage in, these three protocols allows Rabbit Hole to then take that information and say, this guy has engaged with these 3 protocols in this way. Maybe he should do this 4th, interaction on this protocol that he hasn't tried yet. So my on-chain actions belong to me. Rabbit Hole is able to surface those invisible threads and offer a new way for me to engage in the things that I do on-chain. Or investment DAOs like Flamingo. So this gets to the 3rd prong, which is affiliations. I'm a longtime member, a founding member of a group called Flamingo DAO and Noise DAO and Neon DAO and many of these other investment DAOs. We are able to vote on chain. We're able to make decisions as a group and a collective, and those decisions then inform my identity, right? So like the types of person I am in these DAOs, along with the interactions I've done personally, along with the assets that I own, including my PFP or the art I own or the membership cards that I own, all of those things together, bundled together on this trust minimized ledger, start to kind of curate who Derek is on chain. And you can start to back into some kind of identity for me that exists on this trust minimized database. Now, Gallery, getting back to the original hypothetical, can start building social features using those 3 primitives that can't be reproduced in Web 2, right? Like in Web 2, there's no way to be able to track that information, the things that I own on a database that are important to me, that have value, the activities and clubs that I belong to, and on a trustlessly, right? Like, so like I can say I belong to these things, but this is a database that actually proves I belong to these clubs. Or, being able to surface the things that I've done in real life. I can say that I've done these things, but this, proof of database tells everyone what I've actually done. You're able to actually like use those ingredients in really interesting ways. And that design space, I think, will layer or set the stage for what I think on-chain identity and on-chain social could look like in the future. Now, I'm wildly off topic, I think, at this point. I'm running on a tangent, but hopefully some of this is being described and packaged for you, Jason, starts to illuminate how I think about pulling at threads that don't currently exist in Web 2 and playing in a design space around identity that can helpfully build the next iteration of social.
No, I love that. I like the fact that, all your interactions on chain, or your historical interactions with different smart contracts can build up, a unique profile for you. Now, I guess on the flip side of that, all of that data is also public. So is it possible for like a Twitter to just, look on chain, parse that, and then maybe have you sign a transaction to attest that, hey, this is my address, and then just do the same thing? Because I think that's a big problem that faces any social startup, Web 2 or Web 3, right? If the incumbents basically see something taking off, they just replicate a feature and then they just kind of completely kill all of the upstarts.
Yeah. So as a pre-seed and a seed stage investor in consumer Web 3, I'm typically less concerned about what the much larger conglomerates and corporations that have like these existing cost structures are doing. Yes, they can certainly like pull features out. My view is that Web3 offers a brand new petri dish by which people can design products. And it's far more likely to me that projects that understand those primitives and create value, net new value, can reach escape velocity before much larger incumbents like Twitter can reorganize their cost structure or hire the right people to see those opportunities and execute them at the same speed. Like if there's one thing early stage startups have, it's just certainly not resources, right? It's the fact that they have a vision, they have an understanding of the space, and they have time to execute before others, right? Speed, and like reposition and reconfigure their startup and point it in the right direction and turn it into a weapon. I mean, this is the history of startups and entrepreneurship, is being able to disrupt disruptors from previous generations based on a new landscape and being able to turn your thing into a weapon before incumbents are able to change their cost structure around and reconfigure their business model. So my view is that things will reach escape velocity far before, a group like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram is able to find the really interesting surface area. And if not, that's why these projects get acquired, 3, 5, 10 years down the road.
Yeah, actually, it could just going on a slight tangent here, because a lot of what you said, I think especially with the vertical you're focusing on, a lot of these companies will end up being somewhat competitive with very established tech companies in Web 2. Unlike in DeFi, where it's like this completely new thing, you're not really competing with banks just yet. So it seems like in this vertical, you require a bit more maybe experienced founders versus like in DeFi. A lot of the projects we looked at were maybe like college dropouts or maybe people who want a hackathon and trying to turn this, product into an actual company. I guess in your experience, when you look for founders to back, is it mostly like experienced people who have run companies before, or maybe know how the inner workings for large social network companies work, or is it kind of similar with like a DeFi type of quote unquote degen founders as well?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think I'll answer that, but I'll answer it in more of like a global, holistic view of how I think about investing in Web3, which is this is a disruptive technology. And in my view, blockchains and trust minimized ledgers, they're just going to suck everything up. Like this will be the optimal database by which people write information to over the coming decades. And so it's not a matter of like if blockchains are going to be the preferred format or the preferred medium by which information will be written to. It's like when, on what time scale. And so when I think about this technology and investing, and let's take consumer Web3 as an example, I think about investing in the right team, and we can talk about like what that actually means, at the right time. So like, again, it gets back to timing, because I think everything is possible when we're talking about this new design space, working on like the right problem, right? And so when I think about like venture investing, those three things have to be ticked, and there's a million different reasons that follow each of those three categories. I would say in terms of the right time, we just talked about it, like pets.com launched in 2001, and eventually people were buying dog food 20 years later on the internet. It just, the infrastructure wasn't ripe when that happened. And so much like many of the early internet startups, it went out of business, like catastrophic failure, raised a ton of venture, and just wasn't the right time, even though we now have a huge industry of buying cat food and dog food on the internet. There's then like, so that's time. What is the right problem, right? So like, I think lots of things deserve to exist. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a venture backable business, right? So like, there has to be some sort of opportunity set that exists and like some problem that's being solved that I think represents, when I invest at like the seed or, pre-seed or series A stage, some problem that gets solved here that I think recognizes like a humongous total addressable market. So like can create outsized value. Now that narrows things quite a bit, because like I see, 500 pitches a quarter in consumer Web3, and we invest in probably less than 1% of those projects. All of those projects probably deserve to exist in some form. Like they're all solving some problem, but the problem being solved in order to like invest as a venture investor really needs to be something that represents like just a massive market. Then so that's right time, that's right problem, and that's right team, which is the actual question you asked, Jason. So thank you for bearing with me here. So like, what makes up the right team? Well, the right team, to your point, could be someone who's built and sold a company before, so they have founder experience. It could be someone who's worked in that industry before, maybe not as a founder, but someone who, let's just take if they're disrupting Web3 social, maybe worked at Instagram, or they worked at TikTok, or they worked at, pick your, great social Web2 app. And maybe they led products, or maybe they're technical, or maybe they just have some insight knowledge on like how that business worked and the failings and shortcomings of those business and what Web3 could offer. Maybe they're very well connected. Maybe they have a really strong ability to fundraise. Maybe they've, paired themselves with an amazing team already. And so like, I would say like that last part, like what's the right genetic makeup for a group? It could be a million different things. It also could be that they have like this exceptional laser focus on the problem to get solved, and they're going to stop at nothing to solve it. Ideally, they have all of these qualities, right? Like they're just amazing founders. And like where we tend to invest are in founders that satisfy all of those prongs. But I would say the things that really bubble up for me in this question are they are very adept at understanding the landscape of the space that they're trying to build in, maybe because they've worked at a company that did something similar, they have some unique insight or lens on the problem, that they've maybe built product before, maybe they're technical, which reduces the reliance on, engineering talent and outsourcing it to other people and really being able to execute on their vision. They're personable, so they have an ability to hire great people around them or fundraise and to continue to like bring money into the vision. So hopefully some of those help answer the question you're asking, which is like, who's the right founder?
And have you ever broken that rule? Like, have you ever backed a founder that didn't have that experience in the industry, haven't done a company before, but you just have to support them?
Yeah, so I would say the one that comes to mind is Outblocks. So like, I'll just give a quick context on Outblocks. Outblocks is a generative art marketplace that allows creative coders who create algorithmic art to put that art on chain. And Artblocks allows people to mint against that algorithm, which creates a collection that's one of X. So the collection sizes could be 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000. Typically, they're between 100 and 1,000 per artist drop. But each one of the art, because the algorithm exists on chain, and because the way the algorithm works is that your purchase mint acts as the seed to that algorithm, it generates a unique piece of art against that algorithm. So an example would be Fidenza. There's 1,000 Fidenzas in existence. There will only ever be 1,000 Fidenzas. Tyler Hobbs launched the Fidenza algorithm on Artblocks, and every single person that minted a Fidenza has a different Fidenza. And the work, the algorithm, the mint, all of the art used to reproduce that Fidenza on chain, it exists on chain with no external dependencies, which is why people have started to like store value in like these Grail generative art pieces. It's like, as long as Ethereum is producing blocks, these art blocks pieces will persist for the rest of the time, which is pretty elegant compared to a number of like the PFP projects where they're launching, a token on Ethereum, but it really points to IPFS or Arweave or something off chain. So that's the context on Artblocks. It's done almost $2 billion in GMV. And it was created by a founder, his name's Eric Calderon, Snowfro is his pseudonym, who had never done venture before. When I met him, Eric was a CryptoPunks moderator. He was an art lover, and he was running a tile business. He had hired 12 people in Houston, Texas to run a tile business, which he had been running for many years.
A tile,
he was in his
like selling
a tile business, like high-end tiles to companies, to airports, to people who wanted to buy tiles and have well-designed tiles in their spaces. The thing about Eric is that he was so laser focused on this problem that existed and had created a solution that was so elegantly tailored to that problem. The problem being that since the 50s and 60s, people had been doing algorithmic art, creative coding, and using algorithms to create work, whether it was like computers or photographs or and more on the internet, using out code to basically create art, but they had no way to monetize, right? Like there was no way to monetize other than printing out 1,000 unique versions, curating their favorite 3 and trying to sell their favorite 3 on Instagram or, to the person down the street or at the art show in New York or wherever it may be, right? And so what Eric realized was that you could actually automate that entire process and allow creative coders to monetize in a way that was totally unique and opened the aperture for creative coding, which was, instead of having this manual process by which creators of coded art would just like curate and select their 3 to 5 favorites and try and sell those, you could actually create a system by which that algorithm that they created could exist on the Ethereum blockchain. And every mint that was worked against that algorithm would act as the seed, as I described, to create a unique piece of generative art that could be reproduced, which allowed generative art to be fully automated in a way that was previously impossible, right? So like you no longer needed the human touch or human curation. All of this stuff could exist on chain forever. And so there was this, over the last 2 decades on Instagram, there had been this huge proliferation of coded art and algorithmic art with no way to monetize. And so there's this huge intellectual bubble that had formed around creative coding and generative art with no way to monetize. And he created this elegant solution to allow them to do that. And so as soon as he created it, he launched the project with the first project called Chromie Squiggles. It was the first ever Artblocks piece. And that project was meant to be like an instructional template as like a bat signal for creative coders to say, this is what you can do now with Web3 and creative coding and monetizing your craft. And the world's best generative artists saw the Chromie Squiggle and saw Artblocks and just flooded in through the door. And like, it was very clear that this founder who had no previous experience, to the question you're asking, Jason, had never raised money from venture, didn't understand, venture investing, had built a really amazing lifestyle business in a completely unrelated, non-technical sector. It was so clear that he had this vision and this solution to this problem that existed, that this would represent an amazing founder. And that has proven to be true. It's now the platform, the home for the world's generative artists. Their GMV is, through the roof. people are continuing to store value in these digital objects. And art blocks as a result has become, this massive project in the NFT space.
That's interesting, right? Because if you tie it back to what you were talking about earlier, which is not just finding a great founder who's obsessive over the problem, but also a sizable opportunity. At that time, I'm guessing the generative art market wasn't like a massive market. So you almost have to bet on him being able to not just create a great business, but also create an entirely new industry. So I don't know if that assumption is true, and I'm curious, like, what you were thinking when you kind of looked at the problem, and was there like a sizable generative art market at that time already?
So we had done super rare. So I understood, and I had written that thesis around, the on-chain art at that point. So I was fairly well understood on the opportunity. If you could, if there was actually a demand to hold digital objects created by artists, obviously like power law returns, not every crypto art piece is going to be valuable, but should there be valuable crypto artists creating valuable crypto art, massive amounts of value flows would flow to these things. So I understood the power of the ERC 721 and trust minimized ledgers and the opportunity around one-of-one crypto art. So I would just level set with that. Next, I understood that to answer your question directly, there was no generative art market. It was literally people, creative coders, sharing algorithms and creative coding projects on Instagram and on social applications. But there was a lot of them, and there was a lot of interest, and there was a lot of people who loved this cottage industry around generative art and generative works. And you could draw a line back from the 50s and 60s to where it started, and how it really started to spin up these large networks of culture around generative art with the dawn of Instagram and Twitter. And so I guess what I'm describing is the comp was that there wasn't really a comp, but my view again is everything is going to end up on these ledgers. And if you can find massive networks that are starting to form around things that were previously difficult to monetize, or offer a new design space for values to flow from things that aren't currently being monetized, and it feels like the right founder is working on the right problem at the right time, my view is these represent very interesting venture bets on the scale of temporality, how this technology is going to evolve over time. And I would say the stuff that is most likely going to end up on these ledgers in the short to medium term are going to be things that touch consumers, that aren't regulated, that represent, massive networks that have already formed around them in Web 2. So think about the things where networks are forming around Twitch or YouTube or social applications. What are people talking about? How are people monetizing in these spaces? And is there a credible way for that monetization to flow to Web3 rails, knowing that this design space offers something unique to those networks that isn't previously being accessed on YouTube or on Spotify or on Twitch or on Twitter? And I think the more you can tease that out, the more you can see through that, the more you recognize that there are things that do represent those opportunities. You just got to know where to look for them.
I really like that point about finding networks where there are things that were previously hard to monetize, because come to think of it, I think that pretty much sums up basically every successful company.
Everything.
Or most of them, yeah. I never really thought about it that way. So thank you for giving me that.
No problem, dude. And it's the same reason why gaming offers a very interesting landscape, right? I played all of these games for decades. I played competitive Warcraft 3. I was a Diablo 2 hardcore player. I was playing World of Warcraft. All of the information that I wrote to these games through playing them, through owning these assets, through being in guilds, none of that was actually owned by me. It was owned by, Blizzard. It was owned by, different studios. It was owned on their databases. It was owned on battle.net. Even just understanding the fact that all of the work I did to building out my rank or building out my identity or building out my gear could actually be owned by me and trade. These things were trading and selling on eBay for decades, right? There's marketplaces to buy digital objects that aren't on the blockchain. If you just apply blockchain to the, billions of dollars of value that's being created in these games, these internet economies, it's a total layup, right? It's just a trust minimized database for us to prove that we own these things, and then to be able to bestow property rights over the things that we own in ways that are previously impossible because that stuff isn't actually owned by us. it's owned by gaming companies, or it's owned by Facebook, or it's owned by Instagram. My view, again, is like all of this stuff is going to end up on these ledgers, and trying to find the right places to invest is really predicated on where we are in the technology stack and what types of things exist in network form today that could be easily monetized in Web3 tomorrow.
Definitely, and I think that that's an amazing segue to my closing last two questions for you, Derek. Which is, first of which is, what are the narratives within consumer that you think has real legs in 2023? Like some of the biggest trends that you think you foresee are coming with real catalysts.
I'll say a few things. Like I mean, I've touched on a bunch of this stuff already. We just did a number of deals. I would say like 2 or 3 around this intersection of AI and Web3. We have a number of projects that are still in stealth, but this idea that, I mean, like, what are these models really good at? They're really good at allowing people to create things. They're really good at being able to ingest all sorts of information and spit out outputs. I mean, like these public ledgers, blockchains are rich with information, right? And so being able to apply AI-based models to a rich database of information to spit out useful outputs feels like where we're headed. Now, I would say the counter to that thesis is the types of information that we're writing to these ledgers today is still pretty crude. It's like who owns what, and like, you know, where an asset has traveled over its lifetime over the last 3 or 4 years. It's like the information isn't that interesting yet. But my view is that as the density and the richness of the information that gets written to these databases starts to like become very massive, and some of these models that are being, you know, proliferated, these AI-based models are applied to some of this rich database, we'll be able to create all sorts of useful products at the speed, at a new type of speed that we've just never seen before. So I'd say the intersection of AI and Web3 is quite interesting from like a, you know, putting all the sum of the ingredients together, and from like a, you know, maybe a more crude way of thinking about it in the short term is, you know, these AI models are also really good at like UGC, like the information that I write to Facebook or to Instagram or to Twitch, like that's just me as a user creating content. It's UGC, it's user generated content. AI improves the speed by which UGC can get created, and it can be applied to things like music or movies or, you know, all sorts of information, right? And so, and blockchains are a great database for that information. So aside from the fact that I think there's interesting ways to take these models and apply them to the density of information on blockchains, I think the simple layup answer is it also improves the way for us to create stuff, which could end up on blockchains. And so I would say the intersection of AI and Web3 is one that's pretty interesting, and I'm diving pretty deep into right now.
Definitely, and I will end with an easy question. So you mentioned there are 3 DAOs before that you're involved in: Flamingo, I think Noise, and Neon. If listeners only have time to check out one of them, which one should it be, and why?
Yeah, Flamingo DAO is kind of like the granddaddy of investment DAOs. So it launched in the summer of 2020. At one point it turned like $5 or $6 million into over $1 billion in NFT assets.
Wow.
That's obviously come down a little bit because of the, you know, the recent downturn, but still represents a massive, massive portfolio. And I would say that DAO represents what I believe is like where we're going, right? And you know, maybe an orthogonal way to think about investment DAOs is to think about like what value does venture provide? Like venture investors provide 3 types of value in my view. They provide capital, right? So like I give a founder money and then he uses that money to build the thing. They provide connectivity. So like they're able to like network their portfolio companies with one another. They're able to network their portfolio companies with other investors, maybe intros that will help them create better products. And they also, the third thing that investors, VC help with when it comes to founders is advice. So like I've, you know, worked with over 100 portfolio companies at this point. I've built my own. I understand what it means to like build a big venture style project in Web3, and founders like knowing that their investors are able to help give that kind of advice on what it takes to get big. My view is that the job that I serve right now as an early stage Web3 investor is going to be replaced by investment DAOs in the future, because those 3 things that I just described are actually better served by groups of people as opposed to just me, Derek, or my business partner, Steve, right? So again, the 3 things are capital, right? You can, with value flows moving at the speed of light from all around the globe, you can actually form capital much more quickly than it does for us to raise a fund and to deploy that capital. On connectivity, I would say a network of 50 people actually offers a much richer connective experience than, a small venture shop of 8 people. And then on the last one, advice, like obviously I have relevant domain expertise in a lot of ways, and founders really like working with me and my business partner, Steve. But in the future, there's going to be groups of 50 venture investors who have all done all sorts of things that come together to, basically pull capital together, be connected, and provide advice in ways that are actually very awesome for founders. And so Flamingo DAO is an NFT DAO. It invests in the underlying NFT assets. It also invests in projects that, use NFTs. They're investors in a number of like the platforms in Web3 consumer. But like, if you think about what they were able to achieve, it was really largely due to them being a better model for venture investing than, a venture shop, right? There's just more people, they're more connected, there's more capital that was able to flow much more quickly, and they're able to give tremendous advice to their founders. And so I see investment DAOs as being a big part of venture in the future. That already is. I mean, we're seeing DAOs in virtually all the rounds that we do, and they're not very big checks, 50K here or 75K here. But my view is like the Flamingo DAO represents a textbook example of like where we're headed with venture. And if your listeners have time, like that would be a good one to check out just to learn a little bit about the model and see a use case of how this thing is applied to Web3 investing.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you say there. I didn't mean to make it a layup for my Angel Founder Collective tangent, but it really
Let's go. It's the shill. Here comes the Jason shill.
Yeah, thank you so much. But this is really interesting, and thank you so much for giving us all this insight and all these specific examples. We'll include a lot of those resources in the show notes below. And for people who want to maybe reach out to you, maybe they're starting a project, or if they want to follow you, what is the best channel for them to do this?
Yeah, Twitter is where I live. It's at Derek EDWS, DEREK EDWS. You can also learn more about my fund at Collab+Currency. That's COLLABCURRENCY.com. Talks about kind of our thesis in Web3 and a number of our portfolio projects that we work with. I also host a podcast called Proof Podcast with Kevin Rose. So you can check that out on proof.xyz. But Jason, it's been an honor, man. I've been a long-time listener and have enjoyed the finance side of this space and your coverage of it over the last few years. And so excited to get on and chat a little bit more about the consumer side of things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Derek. This has been fun. All right, that's it for this week's episode of the Blockcrunch podcast. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe on your favorite apps. And in case you didn't know, this interview is also available as a video on YouTube. And if you tagged the Blockcrunch on Twitter this week and tell us what you liked about this episode, I'll be sure to respond to you as well. Now, if you'd like to go even deeper, we have a VIP tier where every week or so, we write an in-depth research brief or investment memo on a project. And we'll have exclusive AMAs with myself where I answer all your questions as well. Now, we already have analysts from some of the top funds and companies in crypto as subscribers. So if you're serious about getting an edge in crypto, head on over to theblockcrunch.com/VIP to learn more. And once again, thanks for supporting the show, and I'll see you next week.